Again, hello, thank you for being here, and a warm welcome to the November edition of the Natural Resources Conservation Service Conservation Outcomes webinar series. My name is Elizabeth Creech-Thomas, and I am a Natural Resources Communication Specialist with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS. We host this webinar series to provide key findings, data, and tools to support farmers and ranchers, other land managers, conservation partners, and members of academia in pursuing voluntary conservation efforts across the nation. We will get started with the presentation in just a moment, but first, a few logistics. If you'd like to receive email notifications with information on upcoming webinars, please subscribe to the NRCS Conservation Outcomes topic via GovDelivery. You may do so by following the instructions on the screen, and a direct link to access the GovDelivery subscription webpage will also be available in the meeting chat. And that's at the top of our NRCS Conservation Outcomes webinar series webpage. You're going to hear me say this URL several times today. That is nrcs.usda.gov/conservation/outcomes/webinar. If you are having problems with audio, sometimes computer or mobile device headsets can help. It may also help to leave and re-enter this webinar session. You may access live captions during this webinar by clicking the three dots with the More screen on your meeting screen. Again, we will momentarily post additional links and resources in the meeting chat. One very important resource is our Conservation Outcomes webinar series webpage. That's that URL I just mentioned, and it's currently displayed. This is where you can find resources from today's event, and the recording of this webinar with the presentation slides will be posted to this webpage by early December. Finally, we encourage everyone to type questions or comments into the chat throughout the presentation. We'll address as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end of the event, but if we don't get to your question or you have a follow-up thought, please email me directly at elizabeth.creech-thomas@usda.gov. And with that, it's time to get started. It's a true honor and privilege to introduce our NRCS Regional Conservationist for the West, Mr. Astor Boozer. Regional Conservationist Boozer, thank you so much for joining us today, sir. The floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Elizabeth. I appreciate that. And welcome to the November edition of our Conservation Outcomes webinar series. So thank you guys for joining us today. At USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, one of our driving missions is working with agricultural producers, including ranchers and other land managers, to strengthen their operations and conserve natural resources through voluntary efforts. And as USDA's primary private lands conservation agency, we generate, manage, and share the data, technology, and standards that enable landowners and our many conservation partners to make decisions informed by objective, reliable science. USDA's Conservation Effects Assessment Project, or CEAP, is a multi-agency effort led by Natural Resources Conservation Service to quantify the effects of conservation outcomes and support data-driven conservation decision-making across the nation's working lands. CEAP works closely with our science partners and other federal agencies, members of academia, and partners here at USDA, such as colleagues with the Natural Resources Conservation Service Working Lands for Wildlife effort. Finding from these collaborative efforts inform conservation delivery for NRCS and strengthen management decisions across working lands nationwide. Our Conservation Outcomes webinar series enables us to directly communicate with you, our conservation and research partners and colleagues, agricultural producers, and other private landowners and land managers, the documented outcomes associated with this work. Today's webinar will highlight the outcomes of collaborative voluntary conservation efforts for an iconic grassland bird in the West, and the poster child for wildlife conservation in the Sagebrush rangeland, the greater sage grouse. We launched the Sage Grouse Initiatives in 2010 to deliver win-win voluntary conservation solutions that support ranchers and other landowners in improving the productivity of their working lands while benefiting this species of focus. The initiative has successfully addressed key threats impacting sage grouse by focusing on population core areas. Science has helped strategically guide, refine, and inform these voluntary private land conservation efforts across 11 Western states. I am proud of the work I've seen on the ground, led by landowners and supported by USDA and our partners, to conserve the iconic bird while strengthening working ranchers that serve as the backbone of rural communities. The one part that I am really excited about, guys, is that, you have to have buy-in. The efforts that tied into saving the landscape for the sage grouse and this here iconic bird, there was a few slogans that we used. What's good for the bird is good for the herd, and some other things that were spin-offs of activities. But as we engaged and talked with ranchers, land managers, they began to see that the efforts that we were focusing for the bird paid benefits and dividends within their overall grassland biome section there. Some of the forbs that were there, the water capacity coming back to the stream. So those efforts, really tie into where you focus the management of the landscape, provided that opportunity for bird, but it also provided great opportunities for landowners. That combination of work, that science-based opportunities that people work on constantly, really delivered. And the buy-in of the landowners shows that we were successful in making that move for the landscape, for the bird, for the herd in that whole section there. So today's Conservation Outcomes webinar will provide new findings we can collectively leverage to further conservation of sage grouse and other species across the sage grouse biome, as well as other data-driven wildlife conservation efforts nationwide. Thank you again for joining us, and I'd like to turn this over to Charlie Rewa, our SEEP Wildlife Lead, to provide details on this webinar and introduce our guest speaker. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Astor. I'm Charlie Rewa, leader for the SEEP Wildlife Assessments. And thanks again for everyone for joining us today. We're excited to share some outcomes and insights from the co-produced science generated by our science partners at the University of Montana and others. This science helps inform our efforts with private landowners to conserve rangelands and associated wildlife in the sagebrush biome in the western United States. The wildlife component of SEEP has been supporting co-production of science in this landscape since the launch of the Sage Grouse Initiative back in 2010. But overall, since 2005, SEEP Wildlife has supported over 100 outcome-based assessments through cooperative agreements with our science partners at universities, NGOs, and other federal agencies. Assessment findings, reports, and other documents can be found on the SEEP webpage, SEEP Wildlife webpage included in today's links. SEEP Wildlife has also worked closely with our Working Lands for Wildlife effort, which focuses on generating win-win solutions for producers and at-risk wildlife in various landscapes throughout the country. The Sage Grouse Initiative, with the motto of wildlife conservation through sustainable ranching, is a flagship effort of Working Lands for Wildlife in the West. So today's webinar, presented by Dr. Dave Naugle at the University of Montana, who serves as our Working Lands for Wildlife Science Advisor for the sagebrush biome, will highlight how co-produced science supported by SEEP and other science partners is driving more effective management of the sagebrush sea for the benefit of producers and wildlife. So now I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Naugle for the main webinar presentation. I'll be back at the end of the webinar for the Q&A session. So Dave, the mic is yours.
Greetings from Missoula, Montana this morning, everybody. I'd like to extend a huge thanks to NRCS leadership and our Western Working Lands for Wildlife team, with a huge shout out to my long-term colleague, Tim Griffith. I'd also like to thank SEEP and the Outcomes team for having me this morning, and another shout out to Charlie Riwa, who was an early adopter in SGI science. I'd also extend a thank you to our easement division and our Voyager team in Fort Collins for helping assemble this largest data set to date, which makes today's evaluation possible. And of course, nothing happens in a vacuum. My last thanks goes to our small but nimble science team here at the University of Montana. Today, the Sage Grouse Initiative represents a 13-year commitment and a $616 million investment that has conserved 9.7 million acres to date. The durability of SGI is rare in conservation and depicted here by consistency and landowner participation. So the y-axis is annual enrollment in Western producers with SGI. And I put these two red dashed lines horizontally to show that over all of these years, there's been 150 to 250 new producers annually on average come in to work voluntarily with the initiative. This durability is attributed to an unwavering shared vision of, quote, wildlife conservation through sustainable ranching. Our MO has remained consistent ever since SGI launched in 2010. And looking at the slide now live on the left brings back a lot of good memories, but it was a long time ago. Through 2015, when the Fish and Wildlife Service cited Working Lands accomplishments 43 times in their no-list decision for sage grouse, and now heading into 2024, we're stronger than ever. Outcomes discussed today result from conservation enacted under NRCS's framework for conservation action for the sagebrush biome, shown on the left here. Primary threats limiting this biome and addressed through Farm Bill investments include woodland expansion, annual grass invasions, land use conversion, and mesic degradation. In our short time together, let's jump in here and have a look at SGI by the numbers. On the left-hand side of the slide, SGI investments span 13 fiscal years in 3 different farm bills. Approximately 60% of SGI's $616 million investment is in conservation easements, or ASEP, known under the current Farm Bill as the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. And this is to protect intact grazing lands. The other 40% of this pie chart is in active management, labeled here as EQIP, or known under the current Farm Bill as the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. Breaking EQIP down further as you move to the right-hand side of the slide, these practices represent mostly restorative actions to promote sustainable grazing in yellow, 60%, brush management to remove expanding conifers, 38%, and in blue is invasive weed treatments at 2%. The launch of SGI in 2010 and its continued implementation marks an exponential increase in conservation investments on private lands across the sagebrush biome. So here I show on the y-axis up and down cumulative acreage over time, and then before SGI began and during SGI after 2010. And so these are cumulative, where you add the additional acreage every year for things like easements, brush management, And it's this increasing conservation volume and the durability of it that's benefiting Western rural communities, ranching, and wildlife. Defend the core, grow the core is the battle cry echoing across the sagebrush biome. SGI and partners employ this strategy, depicted here, as a proactive approach for maintaining in green and then growing out in yellow those large intact core rangelands. This preventative targeting of limited resources is preferred over more expensive and reactionary care of degraded rangelands that typically yields poor outcomes. Let's get into defining a term here today. By targeting, I mean deliberately matching up enough of the right practices in the right places to benefit ecosystems. Our working hypothesis for today is that targeting of priority areas, as shown on the left, will result in better conservation outcomes. The alternative hypothesis is random acts of conservation kindness that do not add up to desired benefits, as depicted here on the right. To date, the efficacy of SGI's targeting strategy remains largely untested. Make no mistake, we have tried to accomplish this since we initiated in 2010, but today will be the largest, most comprehensive test of that efficacy to date. Technological advances now allow us to evaluate this question at a biome level scale. So as the outline of today's talk, I'll briefly introduce those technological advances. I'll then walk you through something called the Sagebrush Conservation Design. I'll try and limit myself to two acronyms today. One is SGI, or the Sage Grouse Initiative, and the second one will be SCD, or the Sagebrush Conservation Design. Those technological advances then will allow us to jump into the meat of today's presentation, which is an evaluation of the efficacy or efficiency of SGI targeting of conservation. And of course, since we started in 2010, our overarching goal will be to show how SGI applies new science to continually adaptively improve future conservation efforts. Science from today's talk will be published as a 12 manuscript special issue that I'm co-editing for the journal Rangeland Ecology and Management. As shown on the left, entitled Defend and Grow the Core, a Proactive Plan for Conserving America's Sagebrush Biome, will be published in winter 2024. As shown on the right, a couple of days ago, our application for a symposium on this topic was also accepted from the Society for Range Management. And so we'd love to see you in Sparks, Nevada at the end of January. Our awesome communications team plans to record these presentations and then link them to the open access peer-reviewed science papers and build a future website. And this is how we'll continue technology transfer to our NRCS staff and partners. So the first 6 years ago, advancement in technology was the creation of the Rangeland Analysis Platform. With investments from NRCS and other partners like the Bureau of Land Management, we now have mapped time and space for all rangelands in the contiguous U.S. with two data sets, one shown here as vegetation cover of the primary functional groups that we use in rangeland conservation planning, like perennial forbs and grasses, annual forbs and grasses, shrubs, trees, bare ground. We'll talk a lot about that today. The second data set is production. And so for perennials and annuals, for 16-day and annual estimates in pounds per acre. And another big shout out to NRI, because in creating and training these satellite-based data sets, that plot-based information that continues to be collected along with AIM data on public lands is an irreplaceable set of data sources. I show on the left the title page for the Sagebrush Conservation Design, or SCD. This was developed by an interagency team to support ecosystem-based conservation strategies. Many of the RAP functional group maps were used to be able to develop, identify, and map core areas over space and time. These maps provide a look into the ecological integrity of the entire sagebrush system over time. This was just published in late 2022, and so today this SCD enables this retrospective evaluation of the efficacy of the Sage Grouse Initiative. To get you familiar with the SCD a little bit, on the left, get really used to sort of three mapping entities. The dark blue are core areas. These are our biggest, most intact functioning sagebrush components. Lighter blue are growth opportunity areas for active restoration. So these are just a little bit lower with some stressors that have crept in. And then the tan color are other rangeland areas that in many cases have become much more degraded. So dark blue, light blue, and tan, and we'll see a lot of that coloration in the outcome evaluation. In a nutshell, over time, for the entire biome, there has been a 20 million acre decrease in core areas since 2001 to 2020, as depicted here in time and space. That loss is important in terms of supporting rural ranching communities and providing all of the ecosystem services from rangelands. It also has a direct tie back to things like sage grouse and other wildlife, where these cores support just over half of the world's sage grouse population. Importantly, on the right-hand side, sage grouse abundance is increasing in the dark blue core intact areas and declining precipitously in the tan colored other more degraded rangeland areas. By now, you're saying, okay, Dave, what are the drivers of landscape degradation in the sagebrush conservation design? So showing up the y-axis as a percent contribution, annual grasses are 56% of, quote, the problem, primary threat, followed by woodland expansion or tree cover at 21%, and then human modification, which I've also dash boxed here, things like cultivation, expanding subdivision into open grazing lands, oil and gas development, all of these human modifications where that intact rangeland is transferred into other land uses. The real point of this slide is 80% of the drivers of Western degradation can be addressed through efficient and effective application of Farm Bill resources. So let's have a little insight here into the sagebrush conservation design. Underlying the SCD are scores called sagebrush ecological integrity scores. And so for today's presentation, it's enough to know that there's 5 scores, one for annual grass, one for trees, one for sagebrush, perennial grasses and forbs, and then that human modification. These all get scaled 0 to 1. They're multiplied together into an SEI, or a sagebrush ecological integrity score. Think of these scores like your report card from college. And so you receive a report card that semester. If your Sagebrush ecological integrity scores are in the upper 2 deciles. Today, we're going to color them dark blue and you get A's. If you're in the middle 5 deciles, it's a light blue and those are B's. And we'll throw C's in there. If you're not doing so well and your grades come back in the lower 3 deciles, you're that tan colored other rangeland area. Let's jump in and take a big look at the efficacy of SGI targeting with our measuring tape being the Sagebrush conservation design. On the left, here's how to read this output. I put a dashed box around the top horizontal graphic. This is the biome-wide SCD for private lands. So for all private lands in the sagebrush biome, they classify as 12% core, 36% growth, and 52% other rangelands. Each successive bar as of the year 2020 shows for each of our primary practices, easements, grazing, prescribed grazing, brush management, getting rid of invasive conifer, and battling invasive annuals on the lowest bar. So then I draw this vertical red line. Anything to the right of that is core or growth in dark blue or light blue is better targeting than would have happened under a random distribution of conservation investments. From this, I have 3 take-home messages today. The first is that 62 to 84% of SGI practices are within SCD's core and growth priorities, a pretty high number. SGI targeting is up to a third, specifically between 13 and 36% more efficient than random allocation of Farm Bill resources across private lands. Thirdly, SGI's defend the core approach is largely avoiding areas of low conservation success. Because of the way we built RAP here at the University of Montana, remember, we can look at time as well as space, which is huge in conservation design, because then you have the ability to look at trend. So here is a look at the distribution of core and growth areas in 2001 compared to 2020. 2001 compared to 2020. You're seeing and processing in your brain right now trend and change through time in core. In the last 10 years, this map depicts that change. So now you're looking at blue remained or changed to core or growth in the last 10 years. The tan color remained other rangelands, and the red is where I want to spend my time here. This red area changed from core or growth to other. The point of this slide is that through time, largely as a result of invasive grasses like cheatgrass, ventonata, the other nasty invasives we're dealing with right now in rangelands, has made the Great Basin a much more challenging place to work. So if we want to continue to defend the core and grow the core, this will require up and down the agency and with all of our partners, real landscape thinking. And so I want to move to conifer removal as one of our primary practices as an example. Here are 9 places, and I'm going to coin these today and try it out on you, legacy landscapes. And so these are in the Great Basin, as you see, Nevada, Idaho, Southeast Oregon. These 9 places contain 80% of all of our SGI woodland management efforts, 80% of all of the cuts. And so we said to ourselves, we should be able to go back and evaluate the efficacy of those restorations by looking at ecological integrity scores as shown here up and down the y-axis. So each one of these lines that corresponds to the color of the name of that area, you'll see that scores show SGI either having reversed 7 times or at least halted and going to a flat line, halting that degradation of 9 Great Basin landscapes. So literally this is the tree score for ecological integrity. And before we started working, our grades were getting worse. Maybe we weren't studying as hard. And then as we applied restoration, targeted that area, saturated it with beneficial cuts, you can literally see those curves bend and the integrity of those landscapes start to return. 7 out of 9 times, the other 2 times, we at least held the line and halted that degradation. This is an indication that saturating these 9 landscapes proactively defends those core and growth areas. Another key point to think about at this time with technology is we're literally measuring those conservation outcomes from space. Then we asked ourselves, what about the other 20% of the cuts that weren't targeted or saturated to these 9 landscapes? And so here's what we did here. Follow along. Again, effectiveness, I'm calling the y-axis. And this is calculated as the fraction of the cut areas that improved or maintained core and growth status relative to those background rates of change that are taking place in the Great Basin. And so what we see here is in legacy landscapes, we're 20% more effective compared to only 5% effective in the non-targeted treatment areas. This means that when we get together and plan a restoration and we do it in a core and growth area and we saturate that whole watershed with beneficial practices, we're 4 times more effective than if we go do a single cut somewhere else sort of on our own, rather than being a part of that big community-based effort. These untargeted or scattered cuts are less effective approach to conservation. And in most cases, NRCS is doing a heck of a job of that on the ground and with our implementation. So then we said, okay, we have these 9 legacy landscapes. Let's take a deeper dive. So here's an example of Burley, Idaho, in south central part of the state where conifers have been cut almost since the start of SGI. On the right-hand side now, I'm showing each of those integrity scores. And so basically the green line, the pink line, and the purple lines, they're flat. So there's not a lot of change in sagebrush cover, perennial form and grass cover, or the human footprint. What you do see in the brown tree line is a declining integrity until we got together and put management actions on the ground. And again, you can literally see those benefits plotted in space and time. Unfortunately, if you look at that tan line indicating annual grasses, that ecological integrity continues to decline. And unless we do something about it, it's going to be tougher to get over those hurdles in integrity to maintain core and to move growth back into core status. Then we said, well, why just do it for Burley? Let's look across. And so for those 9 legacy landscapes, in the upper left-hand graph on the screen, color-coded, you'll see that ecological integrity trend. And so for many of these watersheds, we're going to have to address annual invasives to maintain the integrity of initial SGI investments and to return more of those legacy landscapes to core status. At some point, we also are doing an active analysis to look at the intervals at which retreatment for trees will have to occur in order to take care of new incoming tree saplings. And then lastly, I wanted to note in the lower left-hand part of the slide, here I show acreage of trees cut annually. So each one of these are their own annual acreage. And again, before versus during the Sage Grouse Initiative. So you can see that our tree cutting and watershed scale activity took off like a rocket in 2010 when we started. In the last 5 years, the dash line going down shows that acreage falling off. I think this is because we've worked with a lot of the producers that want to voluntarily restore rangelands through woodland management. And I think in the future, that declining acreage in the Great Basin is likely to be offset by increasing cuts that are coming online now east of the Rocky Mountains. Okay, so let's completely change gears, get out of woodlands, and let's look at land use change and conservation easements. So just like the green graph on the previous slide, here on the left, I show that for each year, this is the acreage of conservation easements. And as you see before in gray shading versus during SGI, the acreage of conservation easements is increasing during framework implementation. And then I just remind you on the right-hand side that easements are among SGI's most successfully targeted conservation actions. The top horizontal bar shows the biome-wide SCD for private lands compared to way more, almost 3 times the core area, well-targeted, and more growth in light blue. Then recalling back the drivers of the sagebrush conservation and the threats and declines is that human modification. Now that might only be 3%, but where those impacts occur, they're detrimental at very large landscape scales. An example on the right-hand side here is a partnership called the Pioneer Alliance that our easement division has been very active with, placing conservation easements. And so that sort of really intense green are private lands that are under perpetual conservation easement. And you'll see in that bigger picture how we're connecting an important sage grouse area where the Pioneer Mountains and those private eased lands are connecting down into the craters of the Moon National Monument. Real conservation at landscape scales. This also happens to be conserving a very large pronghorn annual migration shown by radio marked animal locations in pink. And so saturating these Pioneer Mountains in central Idaho is successfully alleviating the threat of subdivision because this landscape happens to be very close to a couple of famous ski areas that are expanding where everybody would subdivide for 40 acres and a horse. But today I wanted to introduce you to the newest and third iteration and update of a cultivation risk map that will help us in our current evaluation and future easement targeting. And so this is a biome-wide tool created by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Jeff Bedrosian is leading this effort. And the color ramp is, if it's dark blue or light blue, there's really no tillage risk there in the sagebrush biome. As you follow the color ramps into yellow, orange, and red, there's some cultivation risk there that would turn intact grazing lands into alternative land use. When you sum this all up on the right-hand side, I put a box around growth and opportunity areas in the right-hand two columns that are at moderate, high, or very high risk. It's only about currently 5% of core and growth areas. So we asked ourselves, what would be the benefit of saturating a watershed with conservation easements to alleviate landscape threats to intact rangelands? Our easements are most successful when we work with willing landowner groups that have brought themselves together and want to be rural grazing communities. That's very much the case in our study area today, where the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance is present, as well as their landowner partners to the south called the Winnett Aces Group. This is a 3-county area. I circled it here with a dashed line. These 3 counties in north central Montana that connect to Canada, those 3 counties are bigger than 9 US states and equivalent to the size of the state of Maryland. All of the red I show are already fully executed conservation easements, and this happens to be Montana's largest SCD defined core area in the entire state. So we asked what happens to Montana's largest core if these existing easements became cultivated. Those findings are shown on the left. And so let me start from top to bottom on the left side. This, the dark and light blue depicts that big intact core area for the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance. And the colors depict this. If it's yellow in the simulation, it would have went from core to growth. If it's orange, it would have went from growth to other. And if it's red, it would have went from core to other. When you add that up, easements are conserving 3.6 times the amount of core area outside as inside their boundaries. On the bottom, then, we said, well, these are mixed landscapes, right? Lots of public land interspersed with deeded private land used for ranching. And so in this bottom left graphic, we said, well, delete out the private lands. All the colors that is left shows the benefit of a voluntary conservation easement on private land and how much it extends into the maintenance of core and growth area on public lands. And so 80% of that benefit spills over and is accounted for on BLM public lands. We've never been able to show this before in the literature, how private land conservation benefits public lands in this ecosystem approach. So the 3 take-home messages here: one is that proactive targeting at-risk ranch lands and saturating the landscape with easements has averted the loss of Montana's largest core area. Those conservation benefits extend beyond the easement boundaries, and easements on private lands definitely increase the ecological integrity of adjacent public lands. In the outline, I promised you a look to the future. Let's do that now by focusing on the left-hand graphic. You interpret these almost like you have throughout the rest of the talk, but I have a twist. The twist is time. So go to the bottom where it says biome-wide SCD. So this is where, on all private lands, core, growth, and other in percentages. But this time, it's not just 2020. This time, I put a box vertically. We have time integrated and not just space. So now you're looking at core, growth, and other distribution in 2010, 2015, and 2020. Now, you can also see time and space for core and growth for invasive annuals, our brush management woodland treatments, and grazing. What I want you to focus on now through time is that dashed vertical line. I call this slippage. And so through time, there's a little bit of degradation going on despite all of our collective and well-targeted efforts. Invasives are largely responsible for declining ecological integrity or slippage over time. In the right-hand blue bar graph, here I depict acreage on the y-axis and an increasing amount of acreage annually. So this isn't cumulative, this is annual treatment acreage, and how it's increasing over time. But the absolute Y value axis is in the tens to 20,000s of acres, not the hundreds of thousands like is characteristic of so many other of our practices. The point here is that SGI is just beginning to treat invasives at large scales. We've seen this threat coming down the pipeline and have intentionally over the last couple of years used our SGI science to shape that conservation narrative and gear us up to battle invasives at bigger scales. This paper, published last year by Joe Smith here at the University of Montana and so many partners, shows that in the Great Basin, annual grass-dominated area has expanded by nearly 900 square miles annually and is moving upslope. On the right-hand side, the new invasive for this landscape is in orange, and you can see its expansion and ascent elevationally. This has been very helpful in having people focus on this as a primary threat and get rallying around it. Second paper, put out also by Joe Smith as a senior author here at UM, was just published last month. Here he took RAP data, the rangeland analysis platform in space and time, and is showing that about 80% of newly invaded rangeland by annual invasives like cheatgrass have not burned in the last decade. And people are reading this going, really? Okay. So we used to think cheatgrass fire cycle, where something burns, you get more cheatgrass, it burns again, you get even more cheatgrass till it becomes a monoculture. What Joe is showing us is how to think differently, and that this is a plant ecology and not just a wildfire issue, because you're seeing new invasions regardless of wildfire. It just screams to move to the right-hand side of the slide to get ahead of this threat and defend those cores and expand them in a preventative manner that's proactive, less expensive, where we have a better chance of maintaining some core. Then there's a group with Ag Research Service, the University of Montana, other working lands partners, Fish and Wildlife Service. They took all of the spatial data, and this is brand new coming off of the press, a new spatial strategy to defend the core from invasive annuals. And so here you'll see in green that these are intact cores, promote resistance, manage propagule pressures. The blue are places to actively restore, suppress invasives, enhance perennials, give them that upper edge in growth. And then the red areas, as we've talked before this morning, are places that are probably fire prevention, fuels management, try to prevent any further spread. Lastly, as we close here, this science is already, from an adaptive management perspective, informing our current conservation delivery. And Jeremy Maestas helped me make this slide to make 4 important points. 1, NRCS's Working Lands for Wildlife and the West National Tech Center has teamed up with the University of Wyoming and other partners and is delivering new trainings to get our staff up to speed to defend the cores against invasives. To me, this is akin, looking back, to when we took on mesic or wetland restoration of wet meadows and riparian areas. I didn't think tech transfer could pull it off, but in 5 years, they have went around the biome as a team and trained almost 1,600 practitioners who take that information home and are restoring mesic areas in their backyards. Number 2 is that there's a new practice payment scenario now for 315 herbaceous weed management, which just launched this fiscal year. Thirdly, 315 has now been added to FY24's Climate Smart Ag and Forest Mitigation Activities list, a huge win that is opening up additional resources to scale up this conservation against this threat. And lastly, as always, NRCS states are leading efforts like the Idaho Cheatgrass Challenge. Six closing points and summaries for today's presentation. If you were to go home, I'd love for these to kind of stick. The first is that the NRCS-led Sage Grouse Initiative is a primary catalyst for rangeland conservation now across the West. Second is that spatial technologies are enabling NRCS to quantify conservation outcomes at biome level scales. Thirdly, is that SGI is successfully targeting most actions, specifically 62 to 84% of all of that implementation, to these core and growth priorities. Fourthly, targeted woodland management is restoring ecological integrity. We have solid evidence of that now. Despite this success, we're going to have to do some follow-up treatment of invasive annuals to safeguard these initial investments. Fifthly, well-targeted easements have averted the loss of Montana's largest core area while increasing the ecological integrity of adjacent public lands, which is just such a huge message to spread and know about in these mixed ownerships. And lastly, and maybe obviously, SGI's next frontier is in scaling up annual invasives to defend and grow core. In closing, I really appreciate your time today. If you'd like to know more about Working Lands for Wildlife, I've put the URL at the top of this slide. And another kudos to our communications team who puts out an e-news that's second to none, which you can voluntarily subscribe to at info@workinglands.org. Thanks. And I'll turn it back to Charlie Rewa for questions and comments.
All right, thanks, Dave. That was a nice comprehensive look at where we've been and where we're going. Appreciate that. I would encourage folks, if you got questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. We do have a question here. We use your yield gap products to illustrate for producers the cost of encroaching trees on their operation. But this rat-based tool only goes back in time to the 1990s. Any thoughts on other ways to help clients understand changes in woodland expansion over time?
Oh, I did keep some slides in. Let me rev up here again. I would say yes. Current slide, and I'll redisplay. Some of our science group, and specifically a shout out to Scott Morford, developed a tool called Landscape Explorer. So in a nutshell, when the pilots came home from World War II, we were worried about this coming to our shores. And so those pilots were hired to take aerial imagery back in the 50s. They took it all, and it's been cataloged, but never put together. And so our group got together and put all of those images in one place. And it's now a free online app that covers the entire western half of the contiguous US. And you can go look at it at landscapeexplorer.org. One of the things that this tool depicts is changes from the 1950s to the present imagery showing changes in expansion in woodlands. So here's the 1950s data and present data. And this is a chunk of ground up just north of me in the Blackfoot Valley. You can see the Blackfoot River. And if there's any denialism that producers have had trees expand into their rangelands and degrade forage quality and abundance, showing them this as a field practitioner can really start a great conversation that leads to conservation.
Okay, great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. You mentioned an ongoing analysis to estimate when conifer cuts would need to be retreated, but stop short of suggesting time intervals. Any spoiler alerts you could share with field practitioners grappling with that issue?
Sure. If it's going to be a separate manuscript in that rangeland ecology and management issue, a spoiler alert, it's probably about 8 to 10 years in Great Basin landscapes where if we've hand felled or masticated, those saplings will be coming back in. And so like SCD's giving us this 2000 to 2020 view, there's probably a retreatment in there to maintain those ecological integrity scores. Yeah, with fire in some of these higher elevation areas, we have some of those in Montana around Dillon country, with Vassiana, mountain sage that's can tolerate fire a little bit better. If you can get rid of the seed bank, those intervals probably expand, and that's well documented in the literature by Chad Boyd and others at the Ag Research Service in places like Burns, Oregon.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
I think we've got time for one more question before I turn it back over to Creech. How do greater sage grouse population numbers correlate with these landscape changes, particularly surrounding easements?
So in general, in the special issue, I would say the science group that has the best handle on this is USGS with Pete Coates, and he's developed LEC clusters, and he watches those ebb and flow, and with his analytic techniques, he can actually take out, right? We know that sage grouse sort of ebb and flow through time. And so he has LEC clusters, and he can look at each one of these landscapes specifically for sage grouse. So you could go into core growth and other with landscape treatments, and he could tell us the efficacy of that. One of the upcoming papers that will be in the special issue, NRCS made this massive investment in the bi-state sage grouse population that straddles California and Nevada, and Pete is monitoring LEC clusters for that population and seeing the efficacy of our easements, our tree cuts, fence markings. And that's going to be a paper in the special issue that shows that if you go to a watershed, do public and private across the fence line, and you treat the right threats with the right practices, you can be successful.
Okay, great. Now we have a few more questions, but I think we kind of ran out of time, so we'll follow up with those offline. So thanks again, Dave. I'm going to turn it back over to Creech for some closing remarks. Thanks again.
All right, so I'll just echo Charlie. Thank you so much, Dave, for your time today. I really enjoyed the presentation, and judging by the questions we had going in the chat, I think others did as well. So we really appreciate it. To the two people who did add questions in the chat that we haven't addressed, my email address is on the screen, and also we'll drop it in the chat again. Please don't hesitate to reach out. I also want to give a huge thank you to Regional Conservationist Astor Boozer for his opening remarks, and to Charlie Rewa and others with the Conservation Effects Assessment Project for the collaboration on this effort. And Thad Heater, who has played a major behind-the-scenes role. Thank you so much, Thad. Once again, please visit the Conservation Outcomes webinar series webpage To access a recording of this webinar and the presentation slides, we'll have those up around December. And then our other big resource we really want to make sure you're aware of is our Conservation Outcomes GovDelivery email address. And that's available on that webpage and is available via the links we're sharing as well. And the last thing, a few people have asked, what's the next webinar? And we're really excited to tell you soon. So we're working right now on the 2024 calendar. We will post that to our Conservation Outcomes Webinar Series webpage. I'll say the URL one more time. It's NRCS.USDA.gov/conservation-outcomes-webinar. And we'll have the new calendar live by the beginning of 2024. So please visit that page regularly. That's where you can find almost all the resources from today. We really appreciate everyone for joining. We appreciate your questions. Have a great day, and we'll see you again next year. Thanks, everyone.